Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
You walk into a dark room, you reach out, you flip a switch, and, instantly the room is just flooded with light.
Right, it's something we do every single day.
Exactly. It is a completely mundane action. But if you stop and really think about it, what is physically happening in the wires hidden behind your walls? Like, what is actually moving, and how does it carry energy?
Yeah, we tend to treat the wiring in our homes like magical pipes.
Yeah.
We just expect the energy to be there the second we want it.
But today on our deep dive, we are going to look at the staggering physics happening inside those copper wires and why the way you've probably been taught that electricity works is actually, well, it's completely backward.
It really is.
We're pulling our insights today from a foundational text, Chapter 8 of the Cambridge International AS and A-level physics coursebook. This is going to be a focused, one-on-one tutoring session, walking through the physics exactly as it appears in the text.
And it's worth noting up front why this deeply theoretical physics matters so much in the real world. The source text actually highlights a fantastic example. It's this micro-hydroelectric scheme built on Kibiri Falls, right on the slopes of Mount Kenya.
Right, I saw that. It's a relatively small setup, I think. It produces just 14 kilowatts of power.
Yeah, 14 kilowatts.
Yeah.
But the arrival of that steady, reliable power completely transformed the local community.
Oh, absolutely. The text mentioned welders suddenly had the juice to use electrical equipment, meaning they could rapidly repair vital farm machinery. And hairdressers could keep their shops open late into the evening because they finally had electric lighting.
It perfectly illustrates that the microscopic behavior of electrons inside a simple copper wire has these profound, world-changing applications. But to really understand those applications, we have to establish some ground rules first.
Okay, lay them on me.
Well, the very first rule the text gives us is to banish a word we all use every single day. We have to stop using the word electricity.
I found that fascinating. It's just too vague.
Way too vague.
I mean, in everyday life, you might use electricity to mean the current or the energy or the power. But in physics, those are three entirely separate, highly precise concepts that behave in very different ways.
Exactly. We also have to adopt a universal visual language, because if you try to draw a realistic, lifelike picture of a complex circuit board,
it would be an unreadable mess.
A total mess, yeah. So engineers and physicists worldwide use an international standard. Specifically, the textbook references IEC 6061CM for circuit symbols.
Okay, so a rectangle is always a fixed resistor no matter what country you're in, and a circle with a V is always a voltmeter.
Right. It guarantees that a computer design program in Tokyo and a human engineer in London can collaborate without a single misunderstanding. It is essentially the universal shorthand of physics.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are abandoning the vague idea of electricity, let's zero in on our first precise concept, electric current.
It sounds good.
We know a wire is made of a solid metal, usually copper. Inside that metal, the atoms form a regular grid, which is a fixed array of positive ions. But one or more electrons from each atom manage to break free.
Yeah, those are your conduction electrons, or you might hear them called free electrons. And because they carry a negative charge, the moment you connect a battery, they are repelled by the negative terminal and magnetically attracted to the positive terminal. So they flow from negative to positive.
Which brings us to a massive, mind-bending historical quirk.
Oh, this always trips people up.
Right. In school, you are taught that conventional current flows from the positive terminal to the negative terminal. But the actual physical electrons are moving the exact opposite way.
It is a notorious point of confusion. The convention was chosen long before anyone had any idea what was actually happening inside a piece of metal, long before the electron was even discovered.
So early scientists basically flipped a coin and guessed the direction of flow.
Pretty much, yeah. They guessed and they guessed wrong.
It is like trying to study highway traffic, but forcing yourself to pretend all the cars are driving backward in reverse. Are we just permanently stuck with this bad guess?
We are, unfortunately. If the names positive and negative had been allocated the other way around originally, conventional current would require rewriting every engineering textbook on Earth.
That's hilarious, honestly.
So you just have to keep it straight in your head. Conventional current goes positive to negative, but the physical reality is electrons moving negative to positive.
Let's talk about that physical movement, because I had a major misconception about how it starts. I always pictured the current starting at the battery, like turning on a hose, and the water has to travel through the empty pipe until it reaches the lamp.
A lot of people visualize it that way. But the free electrons are already present throughout the entire length of the wire, just waiting.
So when I flip the switch, the battery doesn't send new electrons all the way to the bulb. It creates an electric field, and that field propagates through the wire at nearly the speed of light, applying a force to every single free electron in the wire at virtually the exact same time.
Right, they all start moving together simultaneously. That is why the light turns on the very millisecond you complete the circuit. It's not one electron running a marathon. It's a whole crowd taking a step forward at once.
Now, everyone knows current is measured in amperes, or amps, but what blew my mind in the reading is the sheer physical scale required to make a single amp. We're talking about a microscopic world here.
Well, current is just a rate of flow. It's how much charge passes a point in a given amount of time. The formula is delta Q equals I times delta T, and charge itself is measured in coulombs.
Okay, so a steady current of 1 ampere simply means 1 coulomb of charge is flowing past a point every single second.
You've got it. But an electron carries an unimaginably tiny amount of charge, what physicists call the elementary charge, denoted by a lowercase e. It's about negative 1.6 times 10 to the negative 19th coulombs.
That number is just so small, it's hard to grasp. To get just one single coulomb of charge to flow past a point, you need about 6 million electrons.
Yeah, that is a 6 with 18 zeros after it.
Every single second, just for 1 amp.
And because that charge is carried by these individual physical particles, it is what we call quantized. It comes in definite, distinct packets. You can't have half an electron, so you can't have a fraction of that elementary charge floating around in a circuit.
The text does mention one wild exception, though, right? Quarks.
Well, yes, if you dive into particle physics, quarks are the fundamental particles that make up protons and neutrons, and they actually have fractional charges, like 1/3 or 2/3 of the elementary charge.
Oh, wow.
But they never exist on their own. They always lock together in groups, so their combined charge equals a whole integer number anyway. So for our purposes, building circuits, charge is always quantized in whole multiples of the electron.
Okay, so we have billions upon billions of electrons flowing to create a current. But how fast are they actually moving down the wire?
We can figure that out conceptually. The total flow I depends entirely on 4 specific factors.
Okay, what are they?
First, the number density, N, which is how densely packed the free electrons are in the material. Second, the cross-sectional area of the wire A. Third, the mean drift velocity, V. And finally, the charge of each individual carrier, Q.
So that gives us the equation I equals NAVQ.
Exactly. The textbook walks through the derivation. The volume of a wire is area times length. The number of electrons is number density times that volume. And if you divide that total charge by the time it takes to travel the length, you end up perfectly with I equals NAVQ.
This is where we hit a massive paradox, though. When you calculate the math for a standard copper wire carrying a normal current, you find that the net forward speed, that mean drift velocity, is incredibly slow. We're talking about a fraction of a millimeter per second.
It seems impossible, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, I always pictured electric current like a raging river. If the current is high, the water must be rushing incredibly fast. How can they be moving less than a millimeter a second and still power a heater?
What's fascinating here is that you have to remember the environment they are moving through. They aren't flowing down a smooth, empty pipe.
Right, they are inside that solid metal.
Exactly, a dense metal lattice of fixed positive ions. The free electrons themselves are actually zipping around randomly in all directions at immense speeds, around 100,000 meters per second.
But they keep crashing into things.
Constantly. Their journey, pushed by the electric field, is a chaotic, haphazard series of collisions. Think of a pinball bouncing frantically off 100 bumpers.
Oh, that makes sense.
The ball itself is moving very fast, but its net forward progress down the board is actually quite slow. That agonizingly slow forward progress is the mean drift velocity.
The river analogy still holds up, though, if we apply it to the thickness of the wire. If you have a wide, deep river, the water can move very slowly but still deliver a massive volume of water. But if that river narrows into a tight gorge, a smaller area A, the water has to speed up significantly to push that same volume through.
That perfectly captures the mathematical relationship in the equation. If the cross-sectional area gets smaller, if you use a thinner gauge wire, The electrons must drift faster to maintain the exact same current.
And it explains the stark difference between materials, too. The book mentions metals have a massive number density, something like 10 to the power of 29 free electrons per cubic meter.
Right.
But semiconductors, like silicon, have far fewer, around 10 to the 23, so 1,000,000 times fewer free electrons available. Since there are so few carriers, the electrons in a semiconductor have to drift 1,000,000 times faster than they would in copper just to carry the same amount of current.
Exactly. Now, if those electrons are constantly crashing into metal ions and losing momentum, they clearly need a continuous supply of energy to keep pushing forward. Which brings us to voltage.
And here's where the text demands absolute precision. We casually say voltage all the time, but in physics, we must divide it into two strict concepts: electromotive force, or EMF, and potential difference, or PD.
Right. To see the distinction, imagine following exactly 1 coulomb of charge as it travels completely around a simple circuit loop.
Okay, I've got the circuit in my head. A battery and then two fixed resistors in series. Let's say a 20-ohm resistor and a 10-ohm resistor. We follow our 1 coulomb of charge out of the gate.
First, it passes through the power supply, the battery. Here, chemical energy is converted into electrical energy. Let's say the battery gives 12 joules of energy to our 1 coulomb of charge.
Okay, 12 joules.
This energy that is gained from the source per unit charge is the electromotive force, the EMF.
Hold on, I have to stop you there. Electromotive force. We just established this is entirely about energy joules per coulomb. If it's purely a measure of energy transfer, what physical mechanism makes it a force? Are the electrons actually being pushed mechanically, like with a physical spring?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you'll see it's a deeply misleading historical legacy term.
Oh, another one.
Yeah, another one. It has absolutely nothing to do with mechanical force measured in newtons. Physicists just accept the bad name and refer to it purely by the acronym EMFBM to avoid the cognitive dissonance.
Good to know. Okay, so our 1 coulomb of charge is armed with 12 joules of energy. It flows out of the battery and hits the first resistor, the 20-ohm one. As it crashes its way through that resistor, it does work. It transfers some of its electrical energy into thermal energy, heating up the resistor. Let's say it drops 8 joules of energy.
That energy lost, or rather transferred to a component per unit charge, is the potential difference, the PD. The equation is V equals delta W over delta Q. The mathematical relationship is identical to EMF, it's energy divided by charge, but the context is completely opposite.
EMF is the energy gained from the supply, and potential difference is the energy spent at a component.
Exactly.
And if we follow our charge to the next resistor, the 10-ohm one, it spends its remaining 4 joules of energy as potential difference. 8 joules spent plus 4 joules spent equals the 12 joules it started with. The energy budget balances perfectly.
So we know how energy is pushed into the circuit, and we know how to track where it drops. But what determines exactly how much current will flow through a specific component when a certain voltage is applied?
That would be electrical resistance. It is mathematically defined simply as the ratio of potential difference to current, R equals V over I. And the unit, the ohm, is just 1 volt per ampere. If a component has a resistance of 1 ohm, a potential difference of 1 volt will push exactly 1 ampere of current through it.
But reading the definition is one thing. How do you actually figure that out in the physical world? The textbook outlines Practical Activity 8.1, a specific lab setup to measure the resistance of a piece of metallic wire.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To do it, you need 2 pieces of information: the current passing through the wire and the potential difference across it. And the way you hook up the meters to get those readings is incredibly revealing about how circuits actually function.
Right, so to measure the current, you have to connect an ammeter in series with the wire.
Right, because an ammeter is basically a turnstile. It has to be in series, in the exact same direct path as the wire, because every single electron has to physically pass through it to be counted.
Yes, but to measure the potential difference, you connect a voltmeter in parallel. You clip 1 lead before the wire and 1 lead after the wire, creating a separate branch.
Because a voltmeter acts like a toll booth measuring a drop in elevation, it has to sit outside the main flow, comparing the energy of the electrons before they enter the resistor to the energy they have after they've crashed through it.
That's a perfect analogy. And once you have those 2 readings, the math is trivial. If your turnstile, the ammeter reads 2.4 amps, and your toll booth, the voltmeter, reads an energy drop of 6.0 volts, you just divide the volts by the amps.
So 6.0 divided by 2.4 gives you a resistance of 2.5 ohms.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have all the puzzle pieces now, current, voltage, resistance. But how do we bring this all together to measure the actual rate at which all this electrical energy is doing useful work in the real world, like the heat of a toaster or the light of a bulb?
That brings us to section 8.6, electrical power. Power is simply the rate of energy transfer. It is measured in watts, where 1 watt is 1 joule of energy transferred every second.
And we can derive the power of a circuit by merging the concepts we just learned. Since voltage, V, is energy per charge, and current, I, is charge per time, if you multiply them together, voltage times current, the charge factor mathematically cancels out. You are left with energy divided by time, which is power, P equals VI.
Exactly. But the textbook gives us 3 different mathematical faces of power. By substituting in Ohm's law, V equals IR. So you can calculate it using P equals VI, or if you don't know the voltage, you can calculate it using power equals current squared times resistance. P equals I squared R, or conversely, voltage squared divided by resistance. P equals V squared over R.
I used to look at lists of equations like that and wonder why we need 3 different formulas for the exact same thing. It felt like they were just trying to make physics harder.
It's entirely about what information you have available in a real-world scenario,
Right.
And what part of the system you're trying to analyze. There's a brilliant example in the text regarding a power station that proves why having multiple formulas is absolutely essential.
Let's walk through it. Imagine a power station generating 20 megawatts of power, 20 million watts, and it outputs that power at a massive voltage of 200 kilovolts or 200,000 volts. If we use our first relationship, P equals VI, we can find the current.
Right, so 20 million watts divided by 200,000 volts means the current supplied to the grid is 100 amps.
Okay, 100 amps is flowing. But now we have to transport that power across 15 kilometers of heavy grid cables to reach a city. Those cables are thick, but they aren't perfect. They have a small resistance. Let's say the total resistance of the cables is 3 ohms. The engineers need to know how much power is going to be wasted as heat just pushing the current through those cables.
This is where we must use the second relationship, the one that calculates power using current squared times resistance. We know the current is 100 amps.
Right, so 100 squared is 10,000. We multiply that by the 3 ohms of resistance in the cables. 10,000 times 3 is 30,000 watts, or 30 kilowatts of wasted heat.
And this reveals a monumental engineering insight. 30 kilowatts of wasted heat might sound like a lot, but compared to the 20 megawatts the station generated, it is practically nothing. It is only 0.15% of the total power. And why is the loss so incredibly low?
Because the power stations stepped the voltage up to that massive 200,000 volts. By raising the voltage so high, they drastically forced the current down to just 100 amps.
Right. And because the formula for wasted power relies on the current squared, keeping the current as low as physically possible is the absolute key to preventing energy loss. If they had tried to transmit that power at a low voltage, the current would have been massive. And squaring a massive current would mean almost all of the station's energy would literally burn up as heat in the wires before it ever reached a single home.
It's a stunning example of cause and effect in physics. And finally, if you need to know the total energy transferred over a whole day or month, you simply take that power rate and multiply it by the time. W equals IV delta T.
You've just worked your way through some of the most fundamental, vital concepts in electrical physics. You understand not just what the formulas are, but the physical mechanisms driving them.
We've traced it all the way from the symbolic language of circuit diagrams, down to the sluggish, colliding drift of microscopic electrons, up through the transfer of energy, and finally to the massive scale of a national power grid.
The physical reality inside a wire is just far more dynamic and chaotic than the smooth flow we usually imagine.
It really is. On behalf of our deep dive today, and in collaboration with the Last Minute Lecture team, I want to say a huge thank you to you for listening. Thank you for trusting us to guide your physics journey, and for putting in the time to really understand the mechanics beneath the math.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, returning to our very first image of flipping a switch. Every time you turn on a light, the energy transfer through the electric field happens almost instantaneously, flying at nearly the speed of light to make the bulb glow the second you touch the plastic. Yet, the physical electrons, the actual charge carriers delivering that energy, are crawling through the copper wire slower than a snail, constantly crashing into the metal atoms around them. The energy flies, while the particles practically crawl. It completely reframes what you are holding in your hand the next time you pick up a simple piece of copper wire.
Next time you flip that switch, you'll know exactly the chaos happening behind the wall. Keep questioning, keep calculating, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.